Hi, welcome to Creating an Inclusive Climate, part of the Include DC Early Childhood webinar series. This webinar is part of a series on early childhood inclusion that was developed by the DC Special Education Cooperative. The co-op is a small nonprofit charter support organization here in DC. Charter schools elect to become members of the co-op so their staff can access all of our support services and resources. At the co-op, our vision is that all students with disabilities in DC receive a rigorous, individualized, and inclusive education that prepares them for success. We work with charter schools to make that vision a reality. And we do this work in many ways, including PD and training on-site, in person, and through webinar like this one, through resource sharing and technical assistance on special education policy and practice, and also by facilitating collaboration with the OSSE, the Public Charter School Board, and other city agencies. My name is Monica Lesperance, and I am the co-op's Deputy Director and also the Program Director for our Include DC Early Childhood program. One of our many programs is Include DC. Include is a course that we designed for general ed teachers to help prepare them to work in inclusive classrooms in the city. Include is a course that can be taken for credit through Trinity University. Last year, we launched an early childhood-focused cohort of the course through a partnership with Fight for Children. And we've just started teaching our third cohort and are planning to run another one in the spring semester. And thanks to Fight for Children's support, we were able to create this webinar series on early childhood inclusion. This is the second in a series that are based on the curriculum from our Include DC course. Our Include curriculum incorporates several evidence-based practices for inclusive classrooms. The curriculum is also closely aligned with the quality indicators in the Inclusive Classroom Profile Observation and Rating Tool, or the ICP, that you see pictured there on the screen. The author of the ICP, Elena Sokoku, designed that tool so that observers could use it to rate the quality of a classroom's inclusive practices based on certain indicators. So our key areas of inclusive practice are based on those indicators and are listed here on the screen. So the first is climate and community. That's the topic for today's session. We also look at how teachers adapt space, materials, and routines in the classroom so students have access to the curriculum. We look at ways in which adults provide support and guidance to students during learning and play activities. Also, students with disabilities may present with behaviors that are challenging, so we look at ways teachers assist students in solving conflict and how positive behavior is supported in the classroom. And finally, we focus on providing feedback to students with disabilities in supportive and productive ways, and also collaboration and communication among the school team and families. We will have 4 more webinars in this series that address these key practices. In our first webinar in this series that we held in June, we did a big overview of all the key indicators of quality inclusive classrooms and gave some suggestions to schools for how they could start assessing their readiness to implement inclusive practice. In this webinar, we're just going to focus on the key indicators for classroom climate and address these 2 guiding questions. What are the characteristics of an inclusive early childhood classroom, and how can early childhood teachers create a more inclusive climate? When an individual classroom is inclusive, there are a few things that are evident. One is that all teachers in the room have shared responsibility for all students. This means that in a co-taught classroom, the general and special educator are equals and are teachers of all children. It's not just a shared classroom space, but it's truly shared teaching. The curriculum and the structure of the classroom are also designed with the goal of being accessible to all. This means that the activities are not always adapted after the fact to be accessible to students with disabilities, but that those adaptations are built in from the planning stages so that student access is really as seamless as possible. And the third one down, in an inclusive classroom, students with disabilities are not just present in the room, getting the exact same instruction as peers, but are also receiving individualized support to meet goals that is aligned with the general ed classroom content and age-appropriate activities. And while this last one seems obvious, this is where the concept of inclusion is a little bit more nuanced. In an inclusive classroom, you won't see all of the children with disabilities over on one side of the room with a special ed teacher. You'll see children with disabilities participating in meaningful ways with their non-disabled peers in all activities. Again, inclusion isn't just about a location. It's not about the inclusion classroom. It is about an approach and a mindset that all of the staff and teachers in a school share. In recent years, there have been many organizations and agencies, including the U.S. Department of Education, that have put out position statements about the positive effects of inclusion in early childhood. Many of these reports and studies encourage early childhood inclusion, but also acknowledge the barriers and the challenges that many of our schools and teachers face on the ground. In our work with schools, we sometimes find that there are some belief barriers to inclusion that we have to help teachers break down and administrators break down in order for everyone to really understand their role. If we're asking teachers to do more in the classroom, we need to make sure that they're bought in and prepared and have the resources they need to be successful. So one of the first belief barriers that we encounter is believing that the child or the parent is the problem. Sometimes we need to help others see the child through a different lens. Child is not trying to be difficult, not trying to disrupt. They just have a different need that isn't being met. So it's not about blame. Related to that is the role of the environment. Environment shapes human behavior. And as teachers, we can get very territorial about our classrooms. But to create an inclusive classroom, we really have to be willing to make changes to the setup, the structure, and our instructional practices. And that's what's going to lead to desired behaviors in our students. The next belief that needs to be embraced is that adopting space, materials, or an approach for one child will often benefit many. The idea of cheating isn't such a big deal in early childhood, but we do see this in upper grades. When children are all at such different developmental levels, you don't really have that same concern. But we need to work through the belief that and accept that some children just need more or different support than others, and that's okay. And then finally, at any age level, teaching staff and administrative staff need to embrace the idea that fair does not mean equal, but fair is when every child gets what they need to be successful. So once you embrace those beliefs as an individual and as a school, the next step is to start looking at your classroom climate. And setting an inclusive tone and creating an inclusive climate can only be done when you've set the foundation and your own personal intentions. So we really need to ask ourselves, what do we believe? To be successful, we need to believe that all children can learn, and that as a teacher, it's my responsibility to teach all children in my classroom. Then we need to ask, what does our school believe? Because creating an inclusive climate cannot happen in a vacuum. It's hard to have one inclusive climate classroom in a school that doesn't embrace the concept. So if your school community isn't embracing inclusion, it's really hard to have a successful classroom that does. So think about your school as a whole. What's the philosophy? How does the school generally approach the idea of learning differences? If you're not in a school climate that embraces difference and inclusion, you might have some additional work to do. And then finally, understanding the legal foundations that led to this moment, including the rights of your students with disabilities, can be really powerful for setting a tone school-wide. One reason that climate and community is a critical foundation to inclusion is because a sense of belonging to a community is really vital in education. So I want you to take a minute and think of a time when you were in a group or a situation where you felt like an outsider, where you felt like you did not belong. So think of the emotions and the feelings that brought up for you. Maybe some of the words that came to your mind are some of the words that are now up on the screen. When our students feel like they don't belong in a classroom or they don't belong to the community, they start to feel angry, withdrawn, aggressive, sad, lonely, afraid, nervous, and uncomfortable. So now take a minute and think of a time when you felt like you did belong to a group or a situation. How did you feel? What emotions come up? What words come to your mind? Some of those words might have been what you see on the screen here: kind, engaged, comfortable, secure, welcome, happy, and safe. This matters because our students need to feel safe and welcome to be ready to learn. So creating that inclusive climate starts with a teacher who can create a sense of belonging or membership to the group for all students, particularly those students with disabilities in the classroom. We know that a student's social emotional well-being is critical to their academic success. And a student who feels nervous or sad or angry or disengaged, like we saw in the previous slide, is much less likely to be able to engage with the curriculum, to engage with peers, to take academic risks, share ideas, or ask questions. In an early childhood, this can impact a young child's willingness to try a new activity, ask a peer to play, or even speak to a teacher to communicate his or her basic needs. So this is the case for a typically developing child. So think about those who are struggling. Trying something new or taking a risk is an even bigger deal for a child who hasn't had success in the past. And when you're really little, 3 or 4 or 5, sometimes asking a peer to play is a really big risk. So the first step to getting all students to engage in the classroom is making sure that they feel welcome and safe and that they feel like a valued member of the community. So it seems like a kind of basic thing to create a warm, nurturing, safe early childhood environment, but it really is a critical piece to making sure that your classroom is inclusive. It's important for all students, particularly those that struggle. So how do we do this? How do we create a sense of belonging? When we go into classrooms, there are a few things that we look for as evidence of creating an inclusive climate that fosters a sense of belonging. And one of those things are representations of difference in the classroom. So most schools will have books and toys and other images on the walls that have diverse cultures and races and ethnicities, but many don't have representations of differing abilities. So you start to think beyond your classroom library. Where can you represent differences in lots of places? Pictures on the wall, books in the library, posters, pictures at your centers, dolls, dollhouse toys, puzzles, puppets. They're all places where different abilities can start to be represented in the classroom. One of the handouts for this webinar is a list of books that was compiled by a teacher from one of our previous Include DC cohorts. And it's a book list of read aloud books, picture books that have characters with disabilities that you might want to take a look at to incorporate into your classroom read alouds or add to your classroom library. So a sense of belonging in group membership is also a critical part of an inclusive classroom. All students should have their work represented in the classroom to show that they're valued, not just examples that show the best progress toward a standard. So if you have family pictures or self-portraits in the room for your typically developing children, you want to make sure that you have them for your students with disabilities. Even if those are students that only spend a small part of their day in your classroom, you might have students who push in for a few hours a day and then are moved to a different classroom. I would say that especially if students only spend a small part of their day in your classroom, you want to make sure that they know they are welcome and that they're part of the community, so that their images and their work is all represented in the classroom. You are also setting a tone by demonstrating to all your students and your families and other professionals who come into your room that you value all children and that you value all forms of work, whether it's the perfect representation of the standard or the expectation or not. So showing students that they're a valued member of the group is also supported by making sure there are opportunities for all students to contribute to that classroom community. So this includes opportunities to share in class decision-making and choice-making. Processes and procedures that are good for ensuring equity across the board will lend themselves really well to a more inclusive climate. So for example, things you are already likely doing, like using equity sticks to pick a student to choose the song to sing during circle time, or to select a helper to pass out materials. Those are all practices that are going to foster group membership in an inclusive climate. Another way to increase group membership is through class jobs. This is an opportunity for contributing to the community and developing responsibility. So if you have jobs for each child, then you need to make sure that you're also including jobs for your students with disabilities. And you want to make sure that you are including jobs that can be adapted as needed. So for example, if you have a child who's nonverbal, who's going to be your weather person for the day, you need to make sure that you have some visuals or some pictures or another way that they can participate and still do their job without having to speak. So acceptance and celebration of individual differences is something else that we look for in inclusive classrooms. And a lot of creating this inclusive climate is setting the tone by the teacher of modeling acceptance and modeling celebrating differences. So inclusive classrooms that plan activities that embed acceptance and celebration of diverse needs are going to be showing the real support for students of all different needs and helping them feel like they're a member of that community and that classroom. So for example, a teacher might introduce a character in pretend play that has a special need. That's just embedding it into a regular everyday activity you might do in your classroom, of course by reading stories, doing read-alouds with characters that have differences. And then acceptance and celebration of differences also connects to making sure that you are a bully-free zone and that teachers are actively intervening around negative comments and being supportive of children with differences as they interact with their peers. Of course, bullying, teasing, and excluding of children for any reason isn't tolerated. So as I mentioned a minute or two ago, one way to set the tone in your classroom is to start to incorporate read-alouds that feature characters with differences. By making this a part of the diversity that you show in your classroom materials and not a special lesson, you're just creating a climate that makes ability difference part of the everyday classroom experience. And you're showing students that it's a normal part of story time to see a character in a book with a disability. However, when you read these stories, you do want to be prepared to answer questions about differences, though many students won't specifically notice or ask. Certainly, the younger the student, the less likely they are to pick up on subtle differences. Some ways that you can prepare for these types of read-alouds is to be ready to model respectful language when students are talking about disability. For example, a student may have heard a word from their family, like they may have heard the word crippled from a family member and start to apply it to a character in a story with a physical impairment. So you want to prepare yourself to respond to that and provide the student with alternate vocabulary as needed. At the co-op, when we go into classrooms and talk about disability with children, we usually use words like strengths and needs and weaknesses, and we really try to help students focus on how all people are different. For older children, we talk about tools that people use to help them do things, like glasses to help us see or a cane to help us walk, and then classroom tools to help us get our work done. And we always use a tone that shows that these things are just a part of everyday life. Language is clearly very powerful, especially for very young children who are developing language at a rapid rate. But language is a powerful tool for setting the tone and creating that inclusive climate. When we talk about disability, we use something called people first language. And this is just putting the person before the disability, as the person is the focus and the disability isn't their defining feature. It's a small thing and a small change, but it can have a very big impact. Our words are powerful, and in early childhood, we are always modeling language for our students. As you start to talk about disability with parents and other adults in your community, start using people first language. You're modeling it and just showing that the person is the most important part of the conversation. So I just put a few examples up here, and if you're interested in more, there's a nice chart at the Inclusion Project website, and the link is at the bottom of this slide. And you can also see it in the handouts that I've uploaded, so you can go ahead and take a look at more detail. But one example here is just instead of saying special ed students or SPED students, say students receiving special education or students with IEPs. It's just putting the student ahead of the designation of special education. So as we start to wrap up this session, we have a few questions for you to start to ask yourself about your classroom climate. And these are questions that can help you create an action plan for making a small change to beginning to have a more inclusive community. So the first question is, like on the very first slides, what do I believe about inclusion and disability? Sort of checking your own perspective and your own set of beliefs. Another one is, can I find at least 3 classroom items that represent ability diversity in my classroom materials? A lot of the classrooms we go into, we don't see a lot of it. 3 is actually pretty impressive if we find 3 different books or puzzles or representations of differences. So start thinking about places that you can incorporate those into your classroom. Another question is, do I post all children's work without assigning value? Are all of your students represented on your bulletin boards or your art wall? Do your students with disabilities have access to class jobs? And by access, are they really able to complete those jobs in a meaningful way? Are the jobs adapted for them so that they're participating fully? And what opportunities do your students have to make choices that impact the whole group? And then what is one small change that you can make this week to be more inclusive? One of the things that we brought up in this session that you can begin to implement to shift your practices to be more inclusive. So what's next? This is just the very beginning of this series of webinar and additional professional developments that we're doing around early childhood inclusion. The next step is another webinar on environmental supports and environmental adaptations that is scheduled for the end of the month, and the registration is open, so feel free to register, share with your friends. We'll also have an early childhood strand at our Special Education Professional Development Day in December. Topic is yet to be determined, but we will have a special early childhood inclusion session. And then, of course, we'll be hosting a spring cohort of our full-length Include DC course in the spring, and the application will be available in late November. And then if you'd like to read more about inclusion in early childhood, inclusiveschools.org has a lot of great resources. The Inclusion Project link is here for that People First language chart. And if you join our Include DC mailing list, then you'll receive updates on our trainings and other early childhood inclusion-related events that we are either hosting or publicizing for other agencies in the city. So we leave the last portion of the webinar for questions. If anybody has questions, I'd be happy to answer them. You can type them into your chat box. Everybody's on mute. I don't think there are too many on the webinar today, so if you want to use the raised hand function, then I can also unmute you and you can ask your question that way. And if there are no questions, then that finishes the webinar for today. Thank you so much for joining us. For more information about the co-op and our Include DC program, you can visit our website. The address is there. I'll stay on for a few more minutes to answer any questions. And we've also recorded this session, and the link to the recording will be available on our website, so you can share it with staff and friends and anyone that you think might be interested in hearing the information. So thank you again for joining us today, and I will stay on the line for about 10 more minutes. But if you have no questions, then feel free to enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thanks.